She stayed late at school that evening just to ask one simple question. But what she saw through that window, she was never supposed to see, and she couldn't unsee it. Two best friends, one discovery, a secret far too big for them to carry alone. They knew what they had to do next. But who would ever believe them? Everyone applauded him. Everyone trusted him. The whole school called him a hero. They had no idea who they were really clapping for. The hospital had been waiting for weeks. The treatments were ready. $50,000 was promised, but it never arrived. Not $1. Everyone trusted him, parents, teachers, the entire town. But when the school went dark and the doors were locked, the real Mr. Caldwell came out. A locked room in the basement. And inside, bags of cash, money meant for sick kids, hidden in the dark. But who put it there? Look at this guy. Everybody loved him. I mean, everybody. The parents, the teachers, the whole town. They thought he was some kind of hero. And why wouldn't they? He smiled. He shook your hand. He said all the right things. But this is who he really was when the door was shut. Just him and a pile of money that he didn't earn. Money that people gave because they actually cared. And he sat there counting it, smiling. But here's the thing. Two people saw what he did. Just two. Nora and her best friend Kate. They were right there that day. They saw the whole thing, and they couldn't just walk away and forget about it, you know. "We saw it," Nora said. "We can't pretend we didn't." Now, who's going to suspect two kids, right? Nobody. And maybe that's exactly why they had a chance. This all started a few weeks before. One of the kids in class had been really sick, and she'd been gone a long time. Months, actually. So when she finally came back, everyone was just happy to see her. She was still pretty weak, tired. But she was back, and that's what mattered to them. The class wanted to do something for her, help her out somehow. And that's where it all kind of began. Nobody back then had any clue where it was going to end up. The principal, Mrs. Coleman, she really cared about what happened to that boy. So she came into the classroom one morning with an idea. The school was going to do something special. A program, a fundraiser, to help sick kids like their classmate get the care they needed. The whole room lit up. Hands went up everywhere. The kids wanted in, all of them. It felt good. It felt like the right thing to do. And honestly, it was. The idea was never the problem. The problem was the person they trusted to run it. So Nora and Kate started helping with the fundraiser. At recess, they talked about what they could sell, who they could ask, that kind of thing. They wanted to get the other kids involved too. It was mostly just the two of them at first. They weren't trying to do anything big. They just liked their classmate and wanted her to be okay. So they figured they'd help however they could. And then you had Mr. Caldwell, the assistant principal. He gets up there on stage, and everybody just kind of trusted him right away. He had this smile, real friendly, looked right at you when he talked. Said he'd take care of the money side of things. Keep track of it. Make sure it all went where it was supposed to. And people believed him. Why wouldn't they? He seemed like a good guy. That was the thing about him, though. Nobody ever really looked twice. That night, Nora told her parents all about it. The sick kid in her class, the fundraiser, the whole thing. She was pretty excited about it. Her mom and dad just listened, let her talk it all out. They thought it was a good thing she wanted to help. Her dad said something like, "That's really nice of you guys." And that was that. Just a normal evening at home, nobody thinking much of it. So they set up a little stand. Cookies, cupcakes, some lemonade. The two of them stood out there all afternoon selling stuff to whoever walked by. And people actually showed up, bought a bunch. The girls were having fun with it, you could tell. It was going pretty well. Little by little, the money started adding up, a few dollars here and there. All of it going toward the fundraiser. Pretty soon, the parents started chipping in too. They'd come by, drop off some cash, write a check. And Mr. Caldwell was right there for all of it. Taking the money, handing out receipts, thanking everybody. He had a whole system going. Wrote down every donation, real official looking. People trusted him with it, no reason not to. He was the assistant principal after all. There was this big poster up in the hallway, tracking how much they'd raised. And the number just kept climbing. 10,000, then 20, then 30. Every few days somebody would update it, and the kids would stop and check it on their way to class. Everybody was kind of proud of it. The whole school had come together for this. It really did seem like something good was happening. The big celebration happened a couple weeks into it. They set the whole thing up in the auditorium with balloons and this big banner on the stage that said $50,000 raised, which is a huge amount for one school to come up with. And you could feel how excited everyone was about pulling it off. Mr. Caldwell got up there beaming, thanking everybody for all their hard work and going on about how proud he was of what the community had done together. There was clapping. A few people stood up. Nice moment all around. And as far as anyone sitting in that room understood it, the money was for sick kids, and it'd be getting to them before long. So there wasn't really any reason for anybody to wonder if something might be off. A little while after that, Nora went over to the children's hospital to see the kids who were supposed to be getting help from everything they'd raised. She brought a little gift and sat with one of them for a bit. And it was nice. The kid was happy to have someone visit. But while she was there, she started getting this feeling that something was a little off. Because the whole place seemed kind of worn down, and a lot of the equipment looked like it had been there forever. And the nurses all seemed completely stretched thin, like they hadn't gotten any kind of help in a long while. She didn't make a big deal of it in the moment and figured maybe the money just hadn't come through yet, or these things take time. But it stuck with her the whole way home anyway. Something down the hall caught her eye, though. A woman sitting off by herself. A mom, hunched over in one of those waiting room chairs, crying. A nurse had knelt down next to her, hand on her shoulder, just staying with her. Nora slowed. Didn't want to stare, so she looked away. But she'd already seen the face. That kind of tired that goes deeper than one bad day. Whatever was happening with this family, it was bad. And here was the thing. This hospital, these exact families. That was the whole point of the fundraiser. The cookies, the poster, all of it. So Nora stayed put a second instead of walking off. She ended up going over. Asked the woman if she was doing all right, real quiet, not wanting to bother her. And the woman talked to her a little. Her kid had been sick a long time, she said. Treatments cost more than they could keep up with. Then she said the part Nora wasn't ready for. Somebody had told this family money was coming. A donation raised for kids in the same boat as hers. Except it never turned up. She'd waited weeks, called, asked around. All she ever got was people saying they'd look into it, then nothing. Nora just listened. She'd sold cookies for that money, watched the number climb on that poster in the hallway. $50,000. And this woman never saw a cent. That conversation stuck with her. She got home and couldn't really let it go. So she started keeping track. There was a calendar on her wall, and every day she'd think about it. How long had it been now since they raised that money? Weeks. It had been weeks. And that mom at the hospital still hadn't seen any of it. Nora kept doing the math in her head. Fundraiser ended. They hit 50,000. Everybody celebrated. That was a while ago now. So where was the money? If it really went to the hospital, those families would have it by now. Somebody would have said something. But there was nothing. Just days going by, one after another, and that money sitting somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. The more she thought about it, the more it bothered her. Something about the whole thing was wrong, and she couldn't stop turning it over. Next day at lunch, Nora told Kate everything. The mom at the hospital, the money that never showed up, all of it. And Kate got quiet. She could tell Nora wasn't just making something out of nothing. They sat there at the lunch table, leaning in so nobody else could hear. Because if the money really did go where it was supposed to, then why was that family still waiting? Didn't add up. And there was only one explanation that made any sense, even though neither of them wanted to say it out loud. Somebody had taken that money. Somebody who was supposed to be looking after it. $50,000 doesn't just disappear on its own. And the more they talked, the more they realized they were both thinking the exact same thing. Whoever was in charge of that money, that was the one they needed to be looking at. So they started paying attention to Mr. Caldwell. Nothing dramatic, just sort of kept an eye on him. Where he went, what he did. And they noticed he spent a lot of time in his office with the door shut. More than you'd expect. So one afternoon, after most everybody had gone home, the two of them hung back, watched from around the corner, down by the lockers, just to see. And sure enough, there he was, heading to his office again. Looking around first, like he wanted to make sure nobody was watching. The girls stayed real still. They knew if they got caught, it'd be a problem. Two kids spying on the assistant principal. But they'd come this far, and something told them whatever was going on, it was happening behind that office door, and they watched him do it. He got to his office door, and before he went in, he stopped, looked back over his shoulder, checked the hallway, both directions, like he was making sure he was alone. The girls saw the whole thing from where they were hiding. And that right there told them something. Because think about it. If you're not doing anything wrong, why would you need to check if anyone's watching? An honest person just walks into their office. They don't look over their shoulder first. But Mr. Caldwell did. Every move he made was careful, quiet, like he had something to hide. Then he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. And Nora knew, whatever was in that office, he didn't want anybody seeing it. That was the moment she decided she had to know what it was. Nora crept up to the office door. There was a little window in it, and she got up on her toes and looked through. And what she saw, she wasn't ready for. Mr. Caldwell was sitting at his desk, and he had money. A lot of it. Stacks of cash right there out on the desk, and he was counting it. Just counting it. Like it was the most normal thing in the world. The money everybody raised. The money those sick kids were supposed to get. And here it was, in his office, in his hands. Nora pulled back from the window fast, pressed herself against the wall. Her heart was going a mile a minute, because now she'd seen it with her own eyes. This wasn't just a feeling anymore, or a guess. It was real. He had the money the whole time. And she was standing about 3 feet away from him, with nothing but a door in between. A couple days later, They got their chance. Caldwell's office was open and empty, just for a few minutes. So Nora and Kate slipped inside. They knew they shouldn't be in there. They knew it. But they had to find out. So they started looking, fast, real quiet. And it didn't take long. There was a drawer with papers in it. And the second they started reading, they knew they'd found something. These were bank records. And the money, the $50,000, it hadn't gone to any hospital. It went to an account, his own personal account, with his name right there on it. The two of them just knelt there on the floor, staring at the page. There it was, in black and white. He took it. He really took all of it. And now they had the proof right in their hands. The only problem was, they were two kids holding stolen evidence in a room they weren't supposed to be in. Nora held the paper up close, read it again just to be sure she wasn't imagining things. But no, there it was, a bank statement, and it told the whole story right there in black and white. The fundraiser money, all 50,000 of it, moved, not to the hospital, not to any charity, not to one single family sitting there waiting for help, straight into a private account instead. And the name on it? His, Henry Caldwell, assistant principal, the guy everybody trusted, same guy who stood up on that stage and thanked the whole town for being so generous. He'd taken it for himself and then just kept quiet, kept smiling, played the hero the entire time. Her hands were shaking a little now, because this changed everything. Couple minutes ago, it was just a bad feeling, a hunch, two kids guessing at something. And now? Real. On paper. The proof sitting right there in her hands, the actual record of what he'd done. And the thing about seeing something like that, you can't unsee it. Can't just slide the paper back in the drawer, walk off, pretend you never knew. She looked over at Kate. Kate was already thinking it too. They had him. They actually had him. Knowing the truth, though, and being able to do anything about it, two different things entirely. Because who's going to believe two kids? Yeah. They were about to find out exactly how hard it is to bring down a grown man everybody loves. Even with the proof right there in your hand. The paperwork wasn't even the half of it. The money itself was right there in the school. He'd been keeping it close. Stacks of cash, shoved into boxes and envelopes, sitting in some back room like it was nothing. 50 grand. And what was all that cash for in the first place? Bake sales. Kids out on the sidewalk selling cookies after school. Parents digging into their wallets, writing checks they maybe couldn't really swing. Because somebody had stood there and told them it was for sick children. Every dollar in those boxes came from a person who gave it with a good heart. People who wanted to help. People who figured what they handed over was going somewhere it mattered. And instead, it wound up here. A back room, his hands, while some mom sat crying in a hospital hallway over help that was promised and just never showed. Nora stared at all that cash sitting there, and honestly, it made her kind of sick. Because she got it now. The whole picture. This was no mix-up. No delay, no paperwork lost somewhere in the shuffle. No. He'd planned the thing. Ran that whole fundraiser already knowing exactly what he meant to do with the money once it wrapped. Use those sick kids. Use the whole community, every last one of them. And he nearly walked off clean, too. Because who'd ever think to suspect him? That was the thing with a guy like Caldwell. Looked so trustworthy nobody thought to check. Nobody did. Except two kids who just wouldn't let it go. Nora knew they needed more than just a piece of paper. Paper can be argued with. Anybody could say the girls made it up, or got confused, or found some old document that didn't mean anything. So they needed to catch him in the act, show people what he was actually doing. So they waited. A few days later, after school let out, they hung back in the parking lot and watched. And sure enough, there he was, Mr. Caldwell, walking out to his car, carrying 2 big bags. Heavy ones. The kind of bags you'd use to move a whole lot of cash out of a building without anybody noticing. Nora pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking, but she held it steady enough. And she got it. A photo of him, right there, hauling those bags out to his car like a man trying to disappear. That picture, combined with the bank records, that was it. That was the thing nobody could argue with. You could see him doing it with your own eyes. The girls stayed crouched down behind a car, real quiet, hearts pounding. Because if he turned around and saw them right now, 2 kids who clearly knew exactly what he was up to, there's no telling what he'd do. But he didn't see them. He just loaded up his car and drove off. No idea that 2 10-year-olds had just gotten the one thing that was going to bring his whole plan crashing down. They had the paper. Now they had the picture. Time to tell somebody. The problem was figuring out who they could actually trust. That night, Nora sat her parents down and told them everything. And I mean everything. The mom at the hospital. The money that never showed up. Watching Caldwell sneak into his office. The bank records with his name on them. The bags of cash in the parking lot. She laid it all out. Showed them the proof, the papers, the photo on her phone. And at first, you could see her mom and dad weren't sure what to think. It's a lot to take in, right? Your kid comes to you saying the assistant principal stole $50,000 from a children's charity. That's not a normal Tuesday. Part of them probably wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. But then they actually looked at what she was showing them. They read the bank statement. They saw the photo. And the looks on their faces changed. Because there was no explaining this away. It was all right there. Their daughter wasn't making up a story. She wasn't confused. She'd stumbled onto something real, something serious. And she'd been brave enough to chase it down and get the proof. Her mom got real quiet. Her dad just kept staring at the papers. And Nora watched them realize the same thing she'd already figured out. This was actually happening. A man they all trusted had been stealing from sick kids, and somehow it took a 10-year-old to catch him. Her dad finally looked up and said, "Okay, we're not letting this go. We're going to do something about it." And that was exactly what Nora needed to hear. Her parents read through it all, slow and careful, going over every line. And the more they read, the more it sank in. This was bad. Really bad. Her mom kept shaking her head, like she didn't want it to be true. She had a kid the same age as the ones this money was supposed to help. She could imagine being one of those families, sitting in a hospital, counting on help that just never came. Her dad's face went hard. He wasn't a man who got angry easy, but you could see it building. Because this wasn't some stranger doing a bad thing far away. This was their school, their community. Their kid had been out there selling cookies for this, believing in it. And the whole time, a grown man was setting up to pocket every dollar. They looked at the photo again. Caldwell, loading those bags into his car. No other way to read it. And then her parents started thinking about all the other families, all the other parents who'd given money. None of them had any idea. They were all walking around thinking they'd done something good, that they'd helped some sick kids. And meanwhile, the guy they trusted was laughing all the way to the bank. Her mom looked at Nora and asked if she was sure. Really sure about all of it. And Nora said, yeah, she was sure. She'd seen it with her own eyes. That settled it. No more wondering, no more hoping they were wrong. Her parents knew what they had to do now. This was going to the people who could actually do something about it. This was going to the police. The next morning, the whole family went down to the police station. Nora, Kate, and Nora's parents. They brought everything. The bank statement, the photo of Caldwell with the bags, all of it. And they sat down with an officer and laid the whole thing out. Now, here's the part Nora was nervous about. She was a kid. She kept thinking the police were going to look at her and not take it seriously. Just some 10-year-old with a wild story about the assistant principal. That's what she was afraid of. But that's not what happened. The officer listened, really listened, and then he picked up that bank statement and started reading it, slow and careful. And you could see his face change as he went, because the proof was solid. This wasn't a kid making things up. The documents were real. The photo was real. The money really had gone into Caldwell's personal account instead of to the hospital. And it was all right there in writing. The officer asked Nora some questions. How'd she find all this? When did she first get suspicious? And she walked him through the whole thing. The mom at the hospital. The money that never came. Watching Caldwell sneak around. And the more she talked, the more the officer realized this little girl had basically done his job for him. She'd already built the entire case. He told the family they did the right thing coming in. Said this was serious and that they were going to look into it right away. For the first time in weeks, Nora felt like she could breathe a little. She wasn't carrying this alone anymore. The grown-ups whose job it was to handle this kind of thing, they were on it now. But it wasn't over yet. Because having proof is one thing. Actually catching him, actually making it right, that was still ahead of them. And Caldwell still had no idea any of this was coming. He was still walking around the school every day with that same smile, thinking he'd gotten away with it clean. So the police brought in the principal, Mrs. Coleman, the one who'd started the whole fundraiser in the first place, because she cared about that sick kid in Nora's class. They sat her down and laid out what they had. And watching her read those papers, you could see it hit her hard. Because remember, this was her fundraiser, her idea. She'd trusted Caldwell to run it, stood up in front of the whole community and put her name behind it. And now here she was, finding out the man she trusted had been stealing the entire time. Right under her nose. She read through the bank records, and her face just got harder and harder. This was a woman who'd spent her whole career trying to do right by kids. And Caldwell had used her. Used her good intentions to pull off something ugly. You could tell she was angry. Not the loud kind. The quiet, serious kind. The kind where somebody's made up their mind, and there's no walking it back. She looked up from those papers a different person than she'd been an hour earlier. Whatever benefit of the doubt she might have handed Caldwell before, gone now. She knew. And she wasn't about to protect him or sweep it under some rug to save the school a little embarrassment. Some people, when they find out a thing like this happened on their watch, they try to bury it. Worry about how it looks. Not her. She told the police she'd cooperate with everything. Whatever they needed. Records, access, all of it. Because those families deserved better. Those sick kids deserved better. And the only way to make it right was to drag the whole thing out into the light, no matter how bad it made the school look. That's the difference between someone like her and someone like Caldwell. When it actually mattered, she did the right thing. And now the two people at the top of that school, the principal and the law, were both pointed straight at him. Caldwell's time was just about up. He just didn't know it yet. And then they called Caldwell in. Picture it. He walks into that room with his usual swagger, that big, friendly smile. No clue what's waiting for him. Probably figured it was some routine thing. A meeting, a question, whatever. And then he sees them. The police, the principal, the serious looks on every face in the room, and the papers on the table, his bank statement, sitting right there. And you could watch it happen in real time. That smile, the one he'd been hiding behind this whole time, it just started to slip. Slow at first, then all at once, because he knew. Second, he laid eyes on those documents. He knew exactly what they had. Everything he'd worked to keep buried, right there in the open. The careful sneaking around, the quiet transfers, the bags in the car. All of it for nothing. They had him. You could see his mind going, racing, trying to find some way out. An excuse, a story, some angle to talk himself clear the way he always did. But there wasn't one. You can't smile your way past a bank statement with your own name printed on it. The color just drained out of his face. This was a guy so sure of himself. So sure nobody would ever catch on. Because who's going to suspect the nice assistant principal? He'd built the whole plan on being above suspicion. And it got blown wide open by a 10-year-old who sold cookies and paid attention. All that confidence, all that charm, none of it could do a thing for him now. He just sat there. And for the first time, he had nothing to say. No speech, no excuse, nothing. Mask all the way off, and underneath it, just a man who got caught taking money from sick kids. And honestly, he should have been a lot more careful about who he underestimated. Because the person who took him down wasn't a detective, wasn't an accountant, wasn't anybody he'd ever have seen coming. It was a kid. Just a kid who couldn't look the other way, and that was it for Caldwell. The police walked him out, right through the front, past the trophy case, past the office where he'd kept all that cash stuffed in boxes. Same halls he used to walk like he owned them, shaking hands, that smile. Everybody thinking the world of him. And now he's got his head down, getting put in a car out front while people stand there and watch. Nothing left to pretend. He didn't say anything on the way out. What was he going to say? And they watched, all of them. Teachers who'd shared a lunch table with him. Parents who'd shaken his hand and written him checks. Kids who said good morning to him every day and meant it. They just stood along the walls, quiet, while he went past. You can about hear what they were all thinking. Him? No way. Not him. He seemed like such a good guy. But that's how somebody like Caldwell pulls it off. Being likable, that's the whole thing. He learned your kid's name, asked about your weekend, and waited for the answer. Said the right stuff at the right time, and after enough of that, you stopped checking. People stopped checking. A whole town did. And it nearly carried him all the way through. If it had been up to the adults, he's gone, clean, every dollar with him, because not one of them ever stopped to wonder. They saw the suit and the smile and figured that was that. Took a kid. Somebody who hadn't spent years learning to trust him. She just caught something that felt off and wouldn't let it go. Didn't matter how small it looked or how many times she could have shrugged it off. Grown adults walked past Caldwell and saw a good man. One 10-year-old looked a second longer. That's the whole thing. That's what did it. And here's the part that counts. They got the money back. All of it. Police had the records, traced where it went, pulled every cent back out. Every dollar those families put in. Every cookie sold off that little folding table. Every check some parent wrote thinking they were helping a sick kid. All of it. Back. And this time, it went where it was always meant to. The hospital, the kids, the treatments that had been sitting right there out of reach the whole time. That mom, though. The one from the hallway. Crying because the help never showed. She got a call. After weeks of waiting and calling and getting told they'd look into it. It just came. Late, sure. But it came. Her kid was getting what they needed. And she never found out it was two 10-year-olds who made it happen. Girls she'd never even met. She just knew that somehow, after all of it, things were going to be all right. As for Caldwell, he had to answer for it. The charm did nothing this time. Neither did the smile. That whole good guy act he'd been wearing for years, gone, worthless, the second the truth was out, where people could see it. It caught up with him. It pretty much always does. And it was two kids. Two kids nobody ever bothered to look at twice. Who made good and sure of it. So that's the story. That's how a 10-year-old brought down a grown man the whole town trusted. And when you actually sit with that a second, it's kind of incredible, right? Because Nora had nothing special going for her. No training. She wasn't a detective, wasn't an expert at anything. She was a kid who went to a hospital one afternoon, met a mom who was hurting, and then couldn't shake it after. That's where it started. No master plan, nothing like that. Just paying attention, caring enough to ask why. And then, when the why didn't add up, not letting the thing go, even when letting go would have been about 100 times easier. And think how many chances she had to do exactly that. Drop it. Back when it was just a weird feeling in her gut. When following it meant sneaking around, risking real trouble. When she had to sit her parents down and convince them she wasn't making it up. When she had to walk into a police station, 10 years old, and hope to God they'd take her serious. Any one of those moments, she could have quit. Could have gone, you know what? Not my problem. I'm a kid. Let somebody else deal with it. And nobody would have blamed her. Not one person. She didn't, though. And neither did Kate. Right there next to her the whole way. Every step of it. That's the part that gets me about these two. Youngest people in the entire story, by a mile. And somehow the bravest in it. There's something in that worth hanging on to. Because it's so easy to figure you're too small to matter. Too young, too ordinary, too whatever you want to call it. Easy to just assume somebody else has got it. The grown-ups, the people in charge, they'll handle it. But here's the truth of it. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the only one who even clocks that something's wrong is the person everybody else looks straight past. A kid. And every now and then, that kid, just by not looking away, changes the whole thing. Those sick kids got their help because of Nora. That mom got the support she was promised because of Nora. A man who was dead sure he was untouchable is answering for it right now. Because of Nora. One kid. One kid who decided somewhere in there that doing the right thing was worth more than staying quiet and comfortable. So next time you catch yourself thinking you're too small to change anything, too young to whatever it is that day, I want you to think of her. Think about how in this whole story, the biggest difference of all got made by the smallest person in it. She saw what nobody else saw, did what nobody else would. And because she wouldn't look away, everything changed. That's it for this one. If this got to you even a little, you already know what to do. And hey, do me one favor out there. Take care of each other. Look out for the people around you. Keep your eyes open. Because you really never know when just paying attention, when just refusing to look the other way, turns out to be the most important thing you ever do.